Every empire believed it would last forever. Rome had its armies, Britain had its navy, and America, it has the dollar. But what if I told you the dollar isn't just money, it's the backbone of an empire? Every global superpower over the past 500 years has followed the same pattern. A rise driven by innovation and trust, followed by comfort, debt, and decline. And if you look closely, the US is now standing exactly where those other empires once stood at the height of their power. The question isn't whether the dollar will fall. It's how and what comes after. Because behind the charts, the policies, and the politics lies a story as old as civilization itself. The story of power, money, and the moment every empire realizes its crown isn't made of gold, it's made of trust. This is the rise and fall of the dollar empire. How currencies rise to rule the world and why, eventually, they all fall one by one. When you look far enough back, beyond wars, presidents, and elections, history begins to look less like a straight line and more like a loop. You see, over the past 5 centuries, the global economy has been controlled by just a few superpowers. And each time, the same pattern shows up. A small country rises from nothing. It innovates, it trades, it builds. Its currency becomes trusted. The world begins using it. But then wealth turns into comfort. Comfort turns into debt. And debt eventually leads to decline. First, the story begins in Portugal, a small country on Europe's border, armed not with soldiers but sailors. They discovered new sea routes to India and Africa, bringing home spices, gold, and a new kind of trade power. What made them powerful wasn't just what they discovered, but what they built. Trust. Their coins were accepted in ports from Asia to Brazil. And that's how an empire begins, not with weapons, but with credibility. Then came Spain, fueled by gold and silver from the New World. For a while, it seemed unstoppable. Its ships transported literal mountains of silver across the Atlantic. But here's the problem with easy money. It doesn't last. When gold and silver poured in, prices rose, inflation followed, and the empire slowly drowned in its own wealth. It's a bit like winning the lottery, suddenly rich, but unprepared to manage it. Then came the Dutch. They weren't the strongest militarily, but they invented something even more powerful, the stock market. Amsterdam became the world's financial center. Money could flow more quickly, businesses could expand more rapidly, and all of a sudden, the Dutch guilder became the world's leading currency. But even they weren't immune to the cycle. Wars drained their treasury, and new competitors emerged. By the 1800s, the British pound was the dominant currency worldwide. Britain's navy controlled 80% of global trade routes, and its banks financed half of the world's railroads and factories. If you lived anywhere in the 19th century, chances are your money, your trade, and your economy were tied to London. But just like before, power created comfort, comfort created debt, and debt invited decline. After 2 world wars, Britain was broke. The empire that once dominated the seas couldn't even feed its people without loans from the US. And that was when America took over. After World War II, the United States produced more than half of all the world's goods. The dollar was backed by gold, and all major countries agreed to use it for trade. For the first time in history, a single nation controlled both the world's economy and currency. The US dollar has become what the British pound once was, the language of global money. But here's the uncomfortable part. The same signs that appeared before every empire's decline: increasing debt, political division, overconfidence, and the growing gap between the rich and the poor. They are now visible again. And just like every empire before, the US believes it's different. This time, the cycle will break. But history doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes. For nearly 80 years, the US dollar has been the backbone of global trade. But in recent decades, the same strengths that made it powerful are now the very things that make it fragile. Every empire eventually faces 3 questions. How much debt is too much? How long can people rely on you to pay it back? And what happens when your rivals decide to stop playing your game? The dollar is now facing all 3 at once. The US government now owes more than $34 trillion. That's over $100,000 per citizen. How did this happen? Because debt became the easiest answer to every complex problem. Recessions? Borrow. Wars? Borrow. Bailouts? Borrow. And as long as the world keeps buying dollars, America can keep printing them. It's a rare privilege that no other country has, but it comes with a risk. When too much money chases too few goods, you get inflation. When interest payments alone drain your budget, you face stagnation. Eventually, even the richest empire begins paying off old debt with new debt. Ask anyone today, a dollar doesn't buy what it used to. Since 1971, the dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power. Think about that. What cost $1 back then now costs nearly $7. For decades, inflation was gradual and barely noticeable. But in the 2000s, people finally experienced it. Everyday life, rent, gas, food began costing more than paychecks could cover. And when citizens lose trust in money, investors start asking questions too. Because money, at its core, isn't just paper. It's a belief, and belief remains fragile. In the 21st century, something new is unfolding. For the first time in decades, nations are beginning to trade without using the dollar. China and Russia conduct energy trade in yuan. Saudi Arabia discusses new payment systems with BRICS, and central banks worldwide are purchasing gold, not dollars. It's called de-dollarization, and it's not about disliking the dollar, it's about cutting down reliance on it. The problem is that when other nations hold fewer dollars, the US loses leverage. Sanctions, influence, even soft power, all of it relies on the world needing your money. And that need is gradually fading. Meanwhile, technology is redefining what money actually is. Cryptocurrencies, central bank digital currencies, and instant global payment systems are gradually bypassing traditional banks. In a world where a phone app can transfer money across continents instantly, people are beginning to wonder, do we still need the dollar? Or just a dollar? That's not an economic issue. It's a psychological one. Because once people believe there's a simpler, quicker, and safer system, the old one starts to fade. Every empire hits this point. The moment when maintaining power becomes more expensive than gaining it. America's military, currency, and influence remain unrivaled for now. But history shows that empires rarely collapse from invasion, they collapse from exhaustion. The dollar continues to lead global trade, but weaknesses are emerging in its base, not because the system failed, but because it worked too well for too long. Too much power, debt, and comfort eventually erode the most vital thing money needs: trust. And when trust falters, history doesn't ask politely. It replaces. What happens if the dollar falls, and what comes after? Every empire tells itself the same story. We're different, we're smarter, we'll last forever. But when a currency falls, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly and then all at once. So what happens if the dollar loses its status? First, it's quiet. Fewer countries hold US debt. Central banks diversify their reserves. Some trade deals shift to other currencies. Nothing appears dramatic at first, just numbers on a spreadsheet. But behind the numbers, the world's financial system begins to shift. The US has a harder time borrowing cheaply. Imports are getting more costly. Inflation creeps up again. And the same goods Americans once bought easily now cost more. For the first time in generations, the US will experience what other nations have endured for decades. Life without the privilege of printing the world's money. When trust in the dollar drops, global finance doesn't pause, it frantically shifts. Countries are starting to develop new payment systems. Oil, trade, and technology deals start getting priced in other currencies. Investors rush into assets they believe are valuable. Gold, land, energy, technology, and increasingly, data. The US economy would decline compared to others. Stocks would fluctuate wildly. The rest of the world might experience turbulence, but also freedom. Because, for the first time in nearly a century, no single country will control the world's money. So, what comes next? Some say China's yuan might replace the dollar. Others think a basket of currencies such as the IMF's SDRs could replace them. But the truth is, we might not witness another global currency at all. Instead, the future might appear multipolar, where the dollar, yuan, euro, and even digital currencies coexist. Think of it more like a table with many seats rather than a throne. A decentralized world where money moves instantly and without borders. And power is shared, not owned. But let's make it more relatable. What does all this imply for everyday people? It means savings might decline more quickly. Imported goods may increase in price. Interest rates might climb. But it also presents new opportunities in innovation, trade, and technology. When old systems collapse, new ones are born. The end of dollar dominance wouldn't be the end of the world. It would just mark the end of an era and the start of something new. The same pattern that has been repeated for 500 years will happen again. A new power will rise. A new currency will earn trust. And for a while, it will seem invincible. But history always whispers the same lesson. When trust turns into entitlement and innovation turns into debt, the cycle resets. Because in the end, money isn't just about power, it's about belief. And belief always finds a new home. The dollar may fall one day, but the system, the idea of money, will simply evolve. The real question isn't which empire rises next. It's about whether we've learned anything from those that came before. Every empire believes it's the exception, that its power, wealth, and money will last forever. But history quietly reminds us that nothing, not even the strongest currency, can escape time. Gold faded. Silver vanished. The pound gave way to the dollar. And someday, the dollar will pass the torch as well. Not just out of greed, but because progress constantly rewrites the rules. Economies evolve. Technology advances. People adjust. And money, the world's oldest story, keeps finding new ways to be told. So maybe the question isn't when the dollar will fall. Maybe it's what we'll build when it does. Because every collapse is also a reset. Every ending is the start of another chapter. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the world never really stops spinning. It just hands the pen to the next writer. If this video helped you understand the world a little better, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves history and economics. The past is never truly past, especially when it's trying to teach us something.